The crack of thunder jolted Penelope Grant awake, her heart racing as lightning illuminated her small cabin with an otherworldly glow, the Montana Territory wilderness beyond her windows thrashing violently in the summer storm of 1878. She'd weathered many storms alone in the 2 years since inheriting her father's homestead, but something about this one sent a chill through her bones that had nothing to do with the cool night air seeping through the log walls. Penelope slipped from her bed, wrapping a thin shawl around her cotton nightgown as she moved to secure the shutters. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, making the flames in her small iron stove dance erratically. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity as she moved from window to window. "Just a storm," she whispered to herself, though the words brought little comfort. At 23, Penelope had learned self-reliance the hard way after losing both parents within months of each other. Her father's mining accident had come first, followed by her mother's swift decline from grief and illness. The remote cabin, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pines, was all she had left of them. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. Penelope gasped, stumbling backward as the entire structure trembled. The smell of scorched wood filled her nostrils before she could regain her balance. "No!" she breathed, watching in horror as small flames began to lick at the corner of the roof where the lightning had struck. Rain poured in through the new gap, but it wasn't enough to douse the fire that was quickly spreading along the dry timber. Penelope rushed to grab her father's old bucket, knowing even as she did that one person couldn't possibly carry enough water from the creek to save the cabin. But she had to try. The flames were consuming her home, the only sanctuary she had in this wild territory. She had just thrown open the door to make her first desperate trip to the creek when a figure on horseback emerged from the darkness, materializing through the curtain of rain like an apparition. "Hello?" she called out, raising her voice above the storm. "Please help me!" The rider approached rapidly, and as another flash of lightning illuminated the night, Penelope could see it was a man. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his duster coat flapping around his tall frame as his boots hit the mud. "Your roof's on fire, madam!" he shouted, stating the obvious as he rushed toward her. "Anyone else inside?" "No, just me," Penelope replied, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders as rain soaked through her nightgown. "It was struck by lightning." The stranger, a cowboy by the look of him, glanced up at the flames now spreading rapidly across the roof, then back to Penelope's frightened face. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his long duster coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Name's Victor Keller," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "We need to get you somewhere safe. This roof's coming down any minute." As if to confirm his prediction, a section of burning timber crashed through into the cabin, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Penelope let out a small cry, instinctively moving toward the door, but Victor caught her arm. "Nothing in there worth your life, Mississippi. Grant." "Penelope Grant," she managed, staring helplessly as more of her roof collapsed inward. "But everything I own is in there." Victor's expression softened for just a moment, but his grip remained firm. "The storm's getting worse. We need shelter now." A massive bolt of lightning struck a nearby pine, splitting it with a sound like a rifle shot. Victor pulled Penelope against his chest, shielding her with his body as splinters of wood exploded around them. She could feel his heart pounding against her cheek, strong and steady despite the danger. "My horse," he said, guiding her toward the large bay stallion that stood nearby, surprisingly calm amidst the storm. "We'll ride to the overhang I passed about half a mile back. Should keep us dry until this passes." Before Penelope could protest, Victor had lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her. His arms formed a protective cage around her as he took the reins, and despite the terror of watching her home burn, she felt an unexpected sense of security in the embrace of this stranger. They rode through the deluge, Victor hunched over her, his broad shoulders taking the brunt of the storm as his duster coat provided her some protection from the elements. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, water streaming down his face as he navigated the treacherous terrain with remarkable skill. "Always carry dry wood," he explained, setting about building a small fire in the driest spot under the overhang. "Never know when you might need it out here." As the flames caught and began to cast a warm glow over their temporary refuge, Penelope studied her rescuer properly for the first time. Victor Keller was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, revealed now in the firelight, were a striking blue that reminded her of summer skies. "What brings you out in this weather, Mr. Keller?" she asked, settling on a dry patch of ground near the fire. Victor fed another stick into the growing flames before answering. "Was heading to Silver Creek. Got caught in the storm about 10 miles back and decided to push on rather than make camp in the open." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Lucky thing I did." "Silver Creek?" Penelope tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "That's the mining town about 20 miles south of my cabin." "You live out here alone?" Victor asked, unable to mask his surprise. Penelope lifted her chin slightly. "Since my father died 2 years ago. He was a miner who decided farming suited him better. Mother followed him out here, but she passed shortly after him." Victor nodded solemnly. "My condolences, Miss Grant. That's a heavy burden for anyone, especially out here. And you, Mr. Keller? What's your story?" Penelope asked, eager to shift the conversation away from her losses. "Call me Victor," he said, settling beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "I was ranch hand for the Double R outfit near Helena. Owner died, his eastern relatives sold it off." "That's no small thing in a storm like this." Penelope turned to meet his gaze, struck by the sincerity in his eyes. "Yes, thanks to you. But what will I do now? That cabin was all I had. First light, we'll go back and assess the damage," Victor said with practical certainty. "Might not be as bad as you fear. And if it is," he hesitated, "well, folks rebuild out here all the time. Folks with money and help." Penelope countered, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I have either." Victor prodded the fire with a stick. "You'd be surprised how neighbors come together in times like these, even when those neighbors are miles apart." Penelope almost laughed. "I have no neighbors, Mr. Keller. The nearest homestead is the Thompsons, and they're a half-day's ride away." "Then I'll help," Victor said simply, as if offering to rebuild a stranger's home was the most natural thing in the world. Penelope stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only earnest determination. "You're heading to Silver Creek for work. You can't delay that for me." "Silver Creek's been there for 15 years. It'll be there a few weeks from now," Victor replied with a small shrug. "Besides, I'm good with my hands. Built half the structures on the Double R myself." The offer was too generous, too unexpected. Penelope turned away, blinking back tears she hadn't realized were forming. "Why would you do that for someone you just met?" Victor was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling fire and the steadily diminishing rain. "My pa taught me that a man's worth is measured by what he does when no one's watching, and what he gives when he has nothing to gain." He met her eyes again. "I'm not looking to gain anything, Miss Grant. Just doing what's right." Something in his steady gaze made Penelope believe him. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, or perhaps it was simply that in her desperate situation, she needed someone to believe in. "Then I accept your help, Victor," she said softly. "And please call me Penelope." As the night wore on, the storm gradually subsided, leaving behind a gentle rain that pattered against the leaves and rocks. Penelope found herself drifting off, exhaustion finally overwhelming her despite the circumstances. The last thing she remembered was Victor carefully adjusting his coat around her shoulders, his calloused fingers gentle as a summer breeze. Dawn broke with the clarity that often follows violent storms, the world washed clean and glistening with droplets that caught the early morning light. Penelope woke to find Victor already awake, tending to his horse. Penelope's steps faltered as they drew closer, the full extent of her loss becoming clearer with each foot. "Stay here," Victor said, touching her arm briefly before moving to inspect the damage more closely. He circled the cabin, occasionally testing a timber or peering into the remains. When he returned to her side, his expression was serious but not defeated. "Foundation's still good," he reported. "And about half the walls can be salvaged. It's not starting from scratch, Penelope." She nodded numbly, struggling to see the silver lining he was offering. "My father built this cabin with his own hands when he brought my mother out here. Now it's gone." Victor's gaze softened. "Not gone. Changed. Like everything in life." He gestured to the surrounding landscape. "This land's seen fire before. Look there." He pointed to a stand of young pines growing amidst the charred trunks of older trees. "Nature rebuilds. So can we." "We," Penelope repeated, the word feeling strange on her tongue. It had been so long since she'd been part of any. "We." "If you'll have my help," Victor clarified, suddenly looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. Penelope took a deep breath, releasing it slowly as she surveyed what remained of her home. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd be grateful for your help, Victor." They spent the rest of the morning salvaging what they could from the ruins. Most of Penelope's belongings were lost, but they managed to recover her father's tools from a chest that had been partially protected by a fallen beam, and a few cooking implements that had survived near the iron stove. Most precious to her was the discovery of a small tin box containing her mother's wedding ring and a daguerreotype of her parents, miraculously untouched by the flames. "A good sign," Victor said when she showed him the treasures, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Some things are meant to endure." They made camp that night near the creek, a short distance from the cabin ruins. Victor constructed a simple lean-to using branches and his oilskin tarp, providing Penelope with a private space to sleep. As they sat by the fire after a meager supper of rabbit Victor had managed to snare, Penelope found herself studying him with new interest. "Tell me about your family," she said, wrapping her arms around her knees as she leaned toward the warmth of the flames. Victor poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "Not much to tell. Pa was a blacksmith back in Ohio. Ma died when I was young. Pa remarried, had 2 more sons with my stepmother. They're good people." "Why did you leave?" Penelope asked. A small smile played at the corners of Victor's mouth. "Pa's forge wasn't big enough for 3 grown sons. My half-brothers were still young when I headed west. Thought I'd make my fortune in the gold fields, but ended up working cattle instead." He shrugged. "Suited me better anyway. I like the open country. Do you write to them?" "When I can. Pa's not much for letters, but my stepmother writes faithfully. Last I heard, the boys were both working the forge with Pa. Business is good." Victor's eyes reflected the dancing flames as he stared into the fire. "What about you? Any other family?" Penelope shook her head. "Mother had a sister back east, but they lost touch years ago. Father was an only child. It's just me now." Victor nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's hard being alone." "Yes," Penelope agreed softly. "It is." The next morning, they began the real work of rebuilding. Victor rode to the Thompson homestead to borrow their wagon, returning with not only the vehicle but Mr. Thompson himself and his 2 grown sons. The men seemed genuinely pleased to help, expressing no surprise at finding Victor a stranger working to rebuild Penelope's cabin. "Always said you were too far out here on your own, Miss Grant," Mr. Thompson said as they unloaded tools from the wagon. "Good thing this fella came along when he did." Over the next days, the skeleton of Penelope's new cabin began to take shape. Victor proved to be as skilled as he'd claimed, directing the work with quiet authority. When the Thompsons returned to their own homestead after 3 days, promising to check in again the following week, the foundation and partial walls were already in place. Penelope worked alongside Victor, learning quickly and contributing more than either of them had initially expected. They fell into an easy rhythm, rising with the sun and working until dusk, sharing meals and conversation by the fire each evening. 2 weeks into the rebuilding, Penelope noticed a change in their dynamic. Victor's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. His hand would brush hers when passing tools, the brief contact sending unexpected warmth through her body. For her part, Penelope found herself watching the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he worked, admiring the quiet competence in everything he did. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly productive day, Victor cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Once the cabin's finished, I should teach you some basic repairs. In case anything needs fixing after I'm gone." The words, "after I'm gone," hit Penelope with unexpected force. Penelope met his gaze, finding something in his blue eyes that made her pulse quicken. "As have I," she admitted softly. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Victor set aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling and moved to sit beside her on the log they'd dragged near the fire. Their shoulders nearly touched, and Penelope could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've been thinking," he said again, his voice lower now. "Silver Creek might not be the right destination for me after all." Penelope's breath caught. "No?" Victor turned to face her fully, the firelight casting half his face in golden light, the other in shadow. "No. I'm starting to think my journey was meant to end here." Before Penelope could respond, a distant sound caught their attention: horses approaching. They both stood, Victor instinctively moving slightly in front of Penelope as they peered into the darkness beyond their fire. 3 riders emerged from the trees, their features becoming clearer as they approached the circle of light. The man in front was vaguely familiar to Penelope. She'd seen him in town on her infrequent trips for supplies. "Evening," the lead rider called, bringing his horse to a stop several yards from the fire. "Saw your fire. Hope we're not intruding. What can we do for you, gentlemen?" Victor asked, his tone polite but guarded. The man dismounted, followed by his companions. "Name's Harper. These are my associates, Jenkins and Doyle. We're with the Montana Land Company." He gestured toward the partially built cabin. "Heard there was some trouble out this way. Lightning strike, wasn't it?" Penelope stepped forward. "Yes, my cabin was struck during the storm 3 weeks ago. We're rebuilding." Harper nodded, his gaze assessing as it moved between Penelope and Victor. "Admirable effort. Thing is, Mississippi." "Grant," Penelope supplied. "Penelope Grant. Miss Grant. The company I represent has been acquiring land in this area for a planned expansion of the railroad. Your father's claim, now yours, I presume is of particular interest to us." Victor's posture stiffened beside her. "This land isn't for sale," he said firmly. Harper smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps Miss Grant would like to speak for herself." He turned to Penelope. "We're prepared to offer fair compensation. More than fair, considering the current state of your property." Penelope felt a surge of indignation. "As Mr. Keller said, this land isn't for sale. It was my father's claim, registered and legal. I have the papers to prove it." "Papers can be reinterpreted," Jenkins spoke up from where he stood beside his horse. "Especially when claim jumpers are involved." Victor took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving to where his pistol would normally be holstered, though he wasn't wearing it. "What are you implying?" Harper raised his hands in a placating gesture. "No need for hostility. We're simply pointing out that a single woman living alone with an unrelated man might raise questions about the legitimacy of her claim." "That's absurd!" Penelope exclaimed. "Mr. Keller has been helping me rebuild after I lost everything in the fire. There's nothing improper about our arrangement." "Of course not," Harper agreed smoothly. "But the territorial court might see things differently. Homestead claims have been voided for less." Victor's jaw clenched. "I suggest you gentlemen leave." "Now." Harper shrugged, turning back toward his horse. "Think about our offer, Miss Grant. We'll be in the area for a few more days. The company is prepared to be generous, far more generous than the courts might be. He mounted his horse, tipping his hat. Good evening to you both. The three men rode off, leaving Penelope and Victor standing tensely by the fire. Once they were out of earshot, Penelope turned to Victor, her face pale in the firelight. Can they really challenge my claim? Victor ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. I don't know. Land disputes out here can get complicated. But threatening you like that? He shook his head. They're trying to intimidate you into selling cheap. Penelope sank back down onto the log, suddenly feeling the weight of her vulnerability. What should I do? Victor sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Do you want to sell? No, Penelope said without hesitation. This land was everything to my father. He believed in its potential. I can't just give it up because some company decides they want it. Victor nodded, a small smile forming. Then we don't let them take it. But if they go to court, then we'll be ready. Victor interrupted gently. First thing tomorrow, I'll ride into town and speak with the land office. Find out exactly what rights you have and what these men can and can't do. Penelope studied his determined expression, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Why are you doing all this, Victor? You could have been in Silver Creek weeks ago, starting a new job, a new life. Victor was quiet for a long moment, the crackling fire filling the silence between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. Because in all my years of drifting, I've never found a place or a person that made me want to stop. Until now. The simple honesty of his words struck Penelope to her core. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers finding his in the darkness. Victor's hand closed around hers, warm and strong. I don't want you to leave, she whispered, finally giving voice to the feeling that had been growing within her. Victor lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then I'll stay, he promised. For as long as you'll have me. The next morning, Victor rode into town as planned, leaving Penelope to continue work on the cabin. She found herself constantly glancing up at the trail, anxious for his return and wary of Harper and his men reappearing. It was mid-afternoon when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Victor's broad-shouldered silhouette, but it quickly turned to concern when she saw he wasn't alone. Beside him rode Sheriff Davis from the town of Whitewater, and behind them, to her surprise, came the Thompsons in their wagon. Victor dismounted first, his expression serious but not defeated as he approached her. Penelope, you remember Sheriff Davis? The sheriff tipped his hat. Miss Grant. Sorry to hear about your trouble. What's happening? Penelope asked, looking between Victor and the sheriff. I visited the land office, Victor explained. Your claim is solid, your father filed everything properly. But I learned that Harper and his men have been causing problems all through the territory. They represent a company all right, but not one with any legitimate business. They've been pressuring isolated homesteaders to sell, sometimes using force. Sheriff Davis nodded grimly. Been tracking them for months. They've usually moved on before I can catch up to them. Your friend here mentioned they'd been to see you, so I rode out right away. Mr. Thompson approached, his wife beside him. Victor stopped by our place on the way back. Told us what happened. We brought some extra supplies, figured we'd stay and help finish that roof. He glanced meaningfully at the sheriff. Safety in numbers and all that. Penelope was momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by this show of support. I don't know what to say. Thank you all. No need for thanks, Mrs. Thompson said warmly. It's what neighbors do. They spent the remainder of the day working on the cabin, the sheriff joining in despite his official capacity. By nightfall, the roof was nearly complete, and the cabin had taken on a more finished appearance. Mrs. Thompson prepared a hearty stew over the fire, and the impromptu gathering took on an almost festive atmosphere. Sheriff Davis announced his intention to camp nearby for a few days, keeping watch for Harper and his associates. If they show their faces again, I'll have a few questions for them. he said, cleaning his plate of a second helping of stew. That night, after the Thompsons had retired to their wagon and the sheriff to his bedroll a discreet distance away, Penelope and Victor found themselves alone by the fire once more. "I don't know how to thank you," Penelope said softly. "You've done so much more than help rebuild the cabin." Victor smiled, the firelight catching in his eyes. "I told you before, neighbors help each other out here. Is that what we are? Neighbors?" Penelope asked, her heart beating faster as she gathered her courage. Victor reached for her hand, his callous fingers gentle against her skin. "I was hoping we might be more than that, Penelope. If you'll have me." In answer, Penelope leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tentative kiss that quickly deepened as Victor's arms came around her. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I think I started falling in love with you that night in the storm," he confessed. "When you stood there in the rain, more worried about your home than your own safety." Penelope smiled, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "And I think I started falling for you when you wrapped me in your coat and shielded me from the storm. No one had protected me like that since my father died." The days that followed brought more progress on the cabin and, to everyone's relief, no sign of Harper and his men. Sheriff Davis eventually returned to town, but not before extracting a promise from Victor and the Thompsons to send word immediately if the land swindlers reappeared. By the end of the month, the cabin was complete, similar to the original structure but with improvements Victor had suggested. The interior was sparse, most of Penelope's possessions having been lost in the fire, but it was solid and weathertight, ready for the coming winter. On the evening after they'd moved the last of the furniture inside a new bed frame Victor had crafted with his own hands, they stood together on the small porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Penelope said, leaning against Victor's side. "Better than before, in many ways." Victor's arm tightened around her waist. "There's just one thing missing," he said, his voice oddly nervous. Penelope looked up at him questioningly. "What's that?" Victor turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "A husband," he said simply. "If you'll have me, Penelope Grant, I'd like to build a life here with you. Not just a cabin, but a home. A family." Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes as joy bloomed in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Victor Keller. I will marry you." Victor's face broke into a radiant smile as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. Their laughter echoed across the clearing as he spun her around, both of them dizzy with happiness. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Whitewater, the Thompsons standing as witnesses and Sheriff Davis offering hearty congratulations. Harper and his men were eventually apprehended trying the same scheme in a neighboring county, bringing a satisfying conclusion to that chapter of their story. As winter settled over the Montana Territory, Victor and Penelope Keller found themselves snug in their rebuilt cabin. The occasional storm still rattled the windows and sent lightning dancing across the sky, but Penelope no longer feared these natural displays. Instead, wrapped in Victor's arms before the warm hearth, she would remember the night a different kind of lightning had struck the bolt of fate that had brought this man to her door just when she needed him most. When spring arrived, they began expanding the cabin, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have. Victor proved as skilled with crops as he was with construction, and under his care, the land began to yield bountifully. Penelope, meanwhile, started a small apiary, her honey soon becoming sought after throughout the region. 5 years after the lightning strike that had nearly taken everything from her, Penelope stood on the porch of their now thriving homestead, watching as Victor taught their 4-year-old son to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter played at her feet, building towers with wooden blocks her father had carved. "Look, Mama! I'm riding!" young Thomas called, his face alight with pride as Victor led the gentle pony in a circle. "I see you, my brave boy," Penelope called back, her heart full to bursting. As she watched her family, Penelope couldn't help but marvel at how life's most devastating storms sometimes cleared the path for unexpected blessings. The lightning that had struck her cabin that stormy night had seemed like disaster at the time, but it had led her to Victor, to love, to family, to a happiness deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. And when the summer storms rolled in, Victor still wrapped her in his coat, shielding her from the rain as they watched nature's display from their porch, secure in the knowledge that they had built something together that even lightning couldn't destroy.